Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading Chapter 7 of Negro Culture in West Africa, the Vai people, talking about their morals and standards.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Standard of morals among the Vai, before and after marriage. It is a common opinion that among the young of the Africans, the standard of morals is very high. This is especially true where the African is under his own institutions and is uninfluenced from without. We can somewhat understand why this is true. According to the institutions of the African, the greatest caution is taken for the protection of the morals of the young, and particularly the morals of the females. The little girls are taken at about 8 or 9 years of age and placed in the institution of the gree bush, where they remain until they are ready to be married. Note, they can be taken out by their parents, but afterwards the strictest watch is kept over the girls all the time. Among the Vai, the institution in which the girls are placed is called the sand. No male is permitted to visit or go within the limits of this institution. The common belief is that if any man violates this law, he will suffer death. The native men are positively afraid to approach the limits of the gree bush or the sand. The native man is impressed that he will die, but just how he does not know. Certain medicine is placed up where it can be seen on the path leading to the institution, and when it is seen by a male, he will flee quickly from the place as quickly as possible. He believes that if he does not do so, the medicine will witch him and bring death upon him. I am informed that when a male violates the law of the berry mo of the devil bush, simply has the violator poisoned by a member of his family. Among the natives, native authority and institutions must be respected, and the death of some civilized persons is attributed to the violation of native laws and defiance to native institutions or authority. Relative to the berry or sand, societies. So they had their own institutions, which they had and held much respect for, that flourish without outside influence. The vibe, being on the coast and coming in contact with foreign influences, those nearest the line have their morals weakened so that some of the young girls are never placed in the sand. The ease with which violators can escape when near civilized settlements is another influence which tends to weaken the institutions for the moral protection for the young. Foreign civilization very often presents its weakest and evil side, and strong temptations and inducements are held out to the vie for their young maidens, many of whom are very attractive, and it is a matter to be regretted that some of the vie are unable to resist them. So that I think it can be said with truth that the regulations for the protection of the morals of the young are not as strong and stringent nor as effective along the coast and near civilized centers as they are farther into the interior, where the institutions and sentiments which support them are unimpaired. So their proximity and closeness to quote unquote civilized peoples and their interactions through trade and commerce with these people impacted the morals of their young, so much so that some young girls never even got to enter into the institutions for training that would teach them how to be good by women. Though the morals of the Vai as a people are weakened, so far as the protection of the young maidens is concerned, they are more so regarding their protection after marriage, owing to the nature of native institutions. It is a customary law among the Vai that if a woman leaves her husband and goes to another man, the husband may recover from the man double the amount paid for the wife and the price of all articles supplied for her since marriage. In the interior, where it is difficult for a native man always to get the amount paid for a wife, the native provision for the protection of the family seems adequate. But on the coast, the man can more easily pay what is required, and the protection of the native family is proportionately reduced. So, because of this commerce and their ability to make money on the coastlines, their family units were impacted. Moreover, the native women in the interior have few wants and are exposed to few temptations. When they come in contact with outside influences, too often evil, which excite new and varied wants, they become too frequently the prey of, of that dissatisfaction which impairs the marriage bond and in many instances leads to gross immorality. These are the influences to which the bi females near the coast towns are subjected. If they are taken into Liberian families when they are young, they are protected in a way from such influences by a course of training and social duties, which training often serves them in married life. But where they are left in the native towns to come in contact with foreign evil influences without an opportunity to learn the best of civilized life, the baleful effect is plainly seen in the lowering of the standard of morals. Just as there is a tendency to lower the morals of the Vai females found in the coast towns, there is also seen the same tendency to lower the standards of the males. A Vai boy in the interior at an early age is placed in the berry. The restraints imposed upon him there are such as will generally restrain him in after years. But as soon as the native families come in contact with the influences from the coast towns, they soon begin to think that it is not necessary to place their boys in the berry. One of the results is that the boy takes on the new vices without the new virtues. The ease with which he can secure malt liquors tempts him to drink, and he grows to manhood with this blighting habit. Along with drinking grows the equally bad habit of gambling. The native idea of property is communistic. He does not possess the high conception of individual ownership that exists among civilized people. In the interior, the native is restrained by the medicine man and his institutions. In the coast towns, the only restraint is the possibility of being caught. Seeing so many things that he desires, he is tempted to take something that is not his own, and thus many add the habit of stealing to their acquired vices. So it compounds one on top of the other on top of the other because they don't have their institutions in place. On the other hand, many natives are able to increase their earnings, and their increased pecuniary strength often leads some of the men to secure the wives of others. And so the men join the women in loosening the marriage relation and lowering the standard of morals. And just as the natives are led to take up new vices and new crimes, these additions necessarily increase the frequency and diffusion of some of those they already have, so that drinking, gambling, stealing, lying, and immorality increase among the Vais as they approach the coast or the foreigners. The great majority of the people remain loyal to their institutions, but the removal of native institutions in some cases without adequate substitutes has given rise to the evils to which I have called attention to. This is the same thing people talk about. What are you going to replace their religion with when you take it away from them, which is why you leave people to their religions. Similar tendencies are noticed in the coast towns among other tribes along the coast. The question has risen and is frequently discussed by many persons interested in West African affairs as to whether or not European civilization is injurious to the African. They were asking this question in 1909, and they're still talking about and asking that question to this very day. We know that it is. Because of the tendencies that I have noted among the Vai, it is contended with great force and rare ability that European civilization is not good for the African. In support of the contention, it is pointed out that Africans who have contact with Europeans are inferior to those who have not had such contact. The physical and moral superiority of the African in the interior is held up as being in striking contrast to the African of the coast towns, who is not so fine a creature either in strength or in morals. It ought not be denied that the Africans of the interior are superior to the Africans of the coast in morals, nor should it be denied that this inferiority is directly or indirectly due to European contact. It could hardly be otherwise. In all periods of transition, the individual suffers, but society gains. To me, it seems that the great evil of European contact is not so much in the contact as in the failure of Europeans to provide institutions as effective in governing the Africans as are the institutions destroyed by this contact. So the Europeans just wanted to come in and tear down their institutions and and take away their native ways, their medicine man, their gree bush, and their devil bush. but they didn't replace it with anything. And that vacuum left a space for immorality to creep in. No race governed as the African could adopt European civilization without a transitional period in which it would practically be without effective government, and during which period that race would suffer. The slowness with which Europeans must influence Africans makes this transitional period long in Africa. And this is not counting for mistakes in policy and bad methods in administration. As a whole, European contact is not bad per se, and in cases where it is bad, far from being an argument against European civilization, it is simply an argument against methods or individual. Civilization, as we understand it, and as it is defined by the eminent French historian F.P.G. Guizot, is good for the African if only he can get it. Two facts, then, says M. Guizot, in speaking of civilization, are comprehended in this great fact. It subsists on two conditions: the development of social activity and that of the individual activity, the progress of society and the progress of humanity. He said a lot of pretty words to say that in order to integrate into a society, it has to go slowly and in phases. History affords no illustration where such a civilization injured any people. If it injures the African, he will be the first. There is no reason why the African in Africa should not be developed individually and socially as any other race in the world. The trouble is the African has not had enough contact with European civilization, which means he only saw some aspects of European civilization and not the full scope and spectrum of their existence. No doubt, has he had too much contact with the evils of civilized nations and too little contact with their virtues. Civilization, like learning, shows that a little is a dangerous thing. Africans, like other peoples, must drink deep. How easy it is to copy vices. It is difficult to develop a civilization anywhere that really develops the individual as well as society at large. It will be more difficult in Africa, but the difficulty does not lessen the moral obligation of civilized powers toward Africa any more than it destroys the power of European civilization to actualize for the African his highest social destiny. So he was putting it at the feet of the Europeans that were coming in with trade and wanted to take from the Africans and wanted to give them alcohol and drugs and other vices. He was saying that it was their responsibility to develop Africans because they were so busy tearing down African institutions by showing them like the fast life. The medicine man as a moral agent. The medicine man is a prime factor in the equation of by morals. For the moral good or ill, he is consulted in all important matters. When a child is born and the parents desire to know its fate or fortune, they consult the medicine man, who claims to be able to tell them everything they wish to know. He demands his fee in advance, and sometimes he makes a lucky guess. More often, he tells what proves to be untrue or puts in a condition which makes his prediction worthless. The medicine man knows that he does not know and cannot foretell the future of an individual. He knows that he is encouraging superstition and taxing ignorance, and for a fee, he continues to perpetuate what he knows to be a fraud. In all these cases, his moral influence is not good. If one individual desires to injure another, he goes to the medicine man to have him witched. The medicine man takes his fee with the understanding that he is to do certain work. Very often, he does nothing, but in some cases, he secures death by directly or indirectly administering poison. In these instances, his moral influence is bad because he encourages malice and revenge. But he reaches his lowest depths when he becomes a secret instrument for the commission of the foulest crimes. The medicine man, unquestionably, often as has an immoral influence, and he is always careful to secure his fee in advance. As bad as the medicine man may seem, and frequently is, he yet he exerts some good and wholesome influences. For instance, in the case of theft, the belief which he has engendered that through his medicine he can detect the thief is a most effective deterrent from the commission of this crime. And because of this belief, and not because of any medicine, he is often able to pick out the thief through the aid of circumstances and render the greatest service to society and the state. As a result of his influence in these cases, his medicine hung up on a bush in a common rag causes many a thief to pass by what he might otherwise take without detection. In cases of infidelity of a wife, the loyalty of many a woman is maintained merely because of the belief that the medicine man would be able to detect her infidelity by means of his medicine. He therefore is a strong influence not only against the infidelity of a wife, but against all those evils and crimes that so often follow in its trail. His medicine allies fears of the warrior and nerves the arm of him that is sent out in service of his sovereign and his state. His medicine soothes the savage beast and saves it from the pains and pangs of fright and fear. In many ways, the medicine man calms the troubled soul and gives peace to him who is besieged on every hand by wicked, invisible, malignant spirits. He is a product of African conditions. He was created as the great support of native institutions, and with all his faults, under present conditions, he is indispensable to African life. Moral influence of their religion. We have been considering the medicine man as a moral agent. We now come to the moral influence of Bai religion. We have seen that among the Bai, there are two long established religions, the pagan and the Islamic at this time, because Bai of the modern day are primarily Christian, emanating from which there are two separate, distinct moral influences. As the pagan religion no doubt existed prior to the introduction of the Mohammedan faith and is a product of African conditions, its moral aspect is of special interest to the Negro race. The Vai are surrounded, like all West Africans, with a striking and abnormal physical environment. It has been so severe upon the pagans of today that they have been unable to throw off the religion which this abnormal environment imposed. One of the moral results of paganism is that it encourages ignorance and superstition. Its tendency is to lessen the possibility of reforming itself or of being reformed. The paganism, with its beliefs in a multiplicity of invisible spirits malignant to men and capable of assuming varied forms, requires for its existence a comparatively low order of intellect. The intellect is so low that the moral sense hardly rises above a form of egoism. Among the lowest of this class of duty has little place in their moral conduct. They are so busy trying to protect themselves against imaginary and evil spirits that they have neither inclination nor time to consider the improvement of their moral code. It is cold, rigid, and selfish. The great motive which seems dominant is to secure some immediate physical good or escape some immediate physical pain. The order of intellect of these pagans is not high enough to give much more consideration, if any, to abstract ideas of right and wrong. The moral influence of the pagan religion within its scope is very great. That is to say, their religious faith requires they sincerely do. The great misfortune is that this requirement is too small, material, and selfish. I have called attention to what may seem as the bad influences of paganism among the but these bad influences themselves appear to have developed something for the good of the Negro. The greater portion of pagan life among the is taken up with matters appealing to the religious side of their nature. The pagan lives in a constant state of fear. His religion consists chiefly of making offerings and sacrifices to propitiate the anger of beings bent upon his ruin. In fact, he is sacrificing so much that his life is a series of sacrifices, and he is sacrificing not to beings who command his love and devotion, but to what seem to him wicked and sinister spirits with designs upon his life and fortune. Long practice in making sacrifices under such circumstances is calculated to develop the capacity to endure great injury and hardship at the hand of another without entertaining the spirit of revenge. So that slowly the way is being paved for altruism in the very nature and character of the individual. The natural effect of pagan religion among the is to give spiritual training in many of the following essentials of morals: to do good to others, to sacrifice for their benefit your own wishes, to love your neighbor as yourself, to forgive your enemies, to restrain your passions, to honor your parents, to respect those who are set over you. These and a few others are the sole essentials of morals. So as you can see, he was quoting an H.T. Buckle book called Civilization in England, where they talk about some of the morals that they observe the Negro as having. Greetings, Forecast. Thanks for tuning in. The spiritual nature of the Negro has often excited comment. The meekness with which the American Negro endured the cruelties of slavery and his loyalty to the Southern people during the rebellion have both been the subject of comment. The latter has been cited to his credit, and it may be that the former can be. The New Zealanders, the American Indians, the natives of Fiji, and of the Sandwich Islands before the civilization of the white man have passed or are passing from the stage of action. The American Negro alone seems to increase and develop. It may be that the Negro's life and training in West Africa have been of service to him in the United States of America. The physical conditions among the Bai are no worse than they are elsewhere throughout West Africa. The fetish and amulet occupy a large place in native religious life in Africa, as well as among the Mohammedan tribes. The moral influences of Islam among the Bai is not so difficult to determine. The moral code of the Islamic prophet is fashioned after a Sinaitic laws in two series of 5 precepts each. These precepts are well known among the Bai Muslims. They might as well be named as follows. First, to acknowledge there are no other gods but God. Second, to show respect to parents. Third, to not kill children on account of dread of starvation. Fourth, to preserve chastity. Fifth, to protect the life of others except where justice demands the contrary, the blood oath. Sixth, to keep inviolate the property of orphans. Seventh, to employ weights and measures. Eighth, to not overburden slaves. Ninth, judges to be impartial. Tenth, to keep oaths sacred and covenants with God. Such are the precepts which are taught by the priests of Islam among the Bai, those 10 simple things. Their moral influence has given a higher tone to the life of the Mohammedan Bai than is to be found among the pagan Bai. But the fact that Islamic teachings do not disturb the institutions of polygamy and slavery prevents them from developing the kind of moral excellence that exists among Christian nations. However, the knowledge of the Quranic faith and moral code gives to the Muslim Bai a higher order of individual intelligence and moral consciousness. It is seen in the dignity and importance which characterize the individual conduct of the Mohammedan adherents. It is noticed in all the institutions of the tribe, and in nothing is it so striking as in the abstinence from strong drink, gambling, and the common vices of the other Bai people. The scarcity of the means for disseminating the knowledge of the Quran prevents a wider diffusion of the moral principles that it teaches. So that while the moral standard is much higher among the Muslims than among the pagan Bai, the degree of its excellence varies according to the individual worth and the knowledge of the Quranic morals. So although Islam was a good go-between, it had its limits because it did not condemn polygamy or slavery, and it the individual had choices to follow or not follow certain things that were necessary for the better civilization of them as a people. The moral influence of their social institutions. The moral life of the Bai is a product of their social institutions and their severe physical environments. These institutions grow out of the necessities of government for the tribe under circumstances which suggest and enforce their superstitions and beliefs. The berry and sand institutions prepare the young for the duties of native life, of the family, and of the state. They prepare them morally as well as intellectually. The young are trained to respect their parents and elders, to be loyal to the king, and to obey the laws. They are essentials for family harmony are emphasized. All the essentials for family harmony are emphasized, and they are not only instructed in the duties of the living to one another according to native ideas, they are also taught to respect the dead. But in the discharge of these duties to the family, the individual, the state, and the dead, as well as to the gods, temptations present themselves, and bad habits and vices steal upon them before they are aware of the fact. For example, the various gatherings of the people for social pleasure and enjoyment afford opportunities for the beginning of many evils which lead to immorality and crime. At these meetings, the native women dress according to their custom for participation in the dances and promenades. Many of them are very attractive. These are also the times when the young men display their wealth, attraction, and power. Young girls, given by their parents in marriage to men whom they do not love, often fall in love with other men. Sometimes they are attracted by the charms or wealth of men other than their husbands, and this means contentions and the breaking up of homes. So, pretty girls with rich guys, the same thing happens to this day in North America, where you have somebody that made it out, that's got a little bit of paper, that come back to the hood where he doesn't belong, trying to steal all the best girls. It is on such occasions that young men who gamble meet those who do not, and often lead them by degrees to take up that gambling habit, with its temptations to steal, to lie, to fight, and to kill. It is at the social functions and dances that those who drink gin and rum carry it to excess and fasten upon others this liquor habit. Thus, they unbridle passion, deaden intellect, weaken and undermine character, and multiply all their misery and shame. So that while the aim and the effect of native institutions are to govern the individual in the home, in the state, and in society at large, and to develop him in a moral sense and the courage to live the native life according to native law, yet in some of these institutions, there are influences introduced that lessen and sometimes even destroy the happiness of native life. In many a by town, I have availed myself to the opportunity to see both sides. I recall no instance more striking than my experience at Boma. The king had just died. Boma was crowded for a week with people from neighboring towns and half towns. The feast was spread, everybody ate, the drinkers drank, the singers sang, and the music and revelry of the dance was there. But amid all the merriment and debauchery of the town, the Mohammedans went regularly 5 times a day to their mosques to render homage and devotion to their God. To lessen the evils of such an occasion, Islam has done a great deal for the Baha'i, and no doubt in the future will do more. As it was, many refused to participate in the revelry, and many turned away from it in disgust. So Islam made them turn away from this native culture that they had of celebrating and partying when people died. Mr. F.P. Noble, speaking of the morals of the Negro, makes this startling statement: the Negro is unmoral. He wrote that in The Redemption of Africa. Mr. Noble is the author of the most comprehensive study of African missions. His splendid effort is embodied in 2 volumes, liberal in spirit and classic in literary form. His disposition to do full justice to the Negro renders important his reiteration of this old, egregious indictment of the morals of the Negro race. So he changed his mind. It is strange that so fair a writer should make so serious and sweeping a statement against any member of the human family without accompanying it with a proof of its truth. Yet, it is not so strange when we remember that until quite recently, competent travelers, scholars, scientists, and ethnologists were unable to penetrate beyond the mere surface of Negro life in Africa on account of climatic difficulties, the variety of Negro languages and dialect, and the veil and mystery with which the African enshrouds their inner elements of their lives and institutions. And notwithstanding the fact that the world for centuries placed a commercial premium on the proved actual and potential inferiority of the Negro, no one has ever been able to do more than indulge in the statement of half truths and in the publication of willful and wicked falsehoods against the race. So, as he said earlier in the text at the beginning, everything he had read about Negroes until he went to go see for himself was a lie. In encyclopedias and geographies, ethnology books, they were all lying because they didn't have any idea about Negro life and institutions. He also said that it's going to take an African person with African eyes to present African people to the world because you can't present a people to the world through the eyes of an outsider. The time was when the charge that the Negro is an inferior creature would go unchallenged. The world then considered it in harmony with its economic interests. You hear that? That it was in the economic interest of the whole world to say that the Negro was inferior because they could use us. Its ignorance of the Negro was its bliss. But the situation has materially changed. Africa is practically divided among the nations of Europe. This was after the Berlin Conference, and so all of Africa was divided among the nations of Europe. It is now to the best interest of the African colonizing powers to know the Negro as he really is, in order that they may govern him without friction and develop his country to the best advantage. The times demand knowledge and facts of the Negro in Africa. The great powers are being impressed more and more with the necessity of knowing the truth. The great trend of the world's economic thought is to enforce this view. It seems now that we will get the facts. The inner life of the Negro is being studied and presented by competent minds, by men conversant with the dialects and languages of the localities that are being studied. Conclusions now regarding the Negro should be based on facts gleaned from observations made during a residence among the people by those who have mingled with Negroes in their own homes. People think People that think will hardly accept the theory now that the Negro is unmoral unless that theory be supported by competent personal observation of the person expressing it or by facts pointed out by such high authorities such as Miss M.H. Kingsley, Dr. Freeman, Dr. Nassau, Mr. T.J. Aldridge, Captain C.B. Wallace, Mr. John Harford, Mr. Casey Hayford, Mr. John Sarba, Mr. E.D. Morrell, M. Lee Comte Carty, and Sir A.B. Ellis, all people at the time who were writing from living within the midst of those people. Greetings, KW Don 7. How are you this evening? I have searched the works of these able authors in vain to find facts that prove the Negro is immoral. On the other hand, the works of Dr. E.W. Blyden prove the morality of the race. The author of Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race, From West Africa to Palestine, The African Problem, The African Society, and Miss Mary H. Kingsley, and numerous articles concerning the African and his continent has presented facts enough to convince any mind not sealed against the truth that the Negro is not immoral. The fact is, just as he says, there is no doubt that in spite of the countless books which have been published on Africa, there still exists in Europe a deplorable ignorance of true character and condition of the natives, and not only among them, the men in the streets, but often among those who have become responsible for the government of large portions of this continent since the so-called partition of Africa has taken place. So this ideology that we're immoral as African people permeated the thoughts of those that were the ruling, of those that were at the Berlin Conference that sat down and became the rulers and colonizers of the continent, because they still were driven by the profit motive. To say that the Negro is immoral is tantamount to saying that he has no moral perception, that his life involves no idea whatever of morality. In spite of the works of the previously named eminent authorities on the Negro and those of the 18th century and before, the inner life, past and present of the great Black race occupying a broad belt of territory across the African continent from Senegal to the Red Sea, for the most part, is still unknown. But as far as it has been studied, the results disclosed will not warrant the conclusion that the Negro is unmoral. But even if they did, the greater mass of the millions of African Blacks, when studied and known, might reverse this conclusion. Basing her opinion on what is known at the time, what was known at that time, Miss Kingsley said, if the Europeans only knew the African as he really is, they might say the African is very different from the European. Yet would say he is a fine fellow and we can be friends. How many individuals of Occidental civilization are there who have not confused the difference with inferiority, and who are not still deceived by the thought that to be different from them and their civilizations is to be inferior? Few have suffered more from this error than has the Negro. But this delusion is being swept away by knowledge. This brings us to Mary H. Kingsley. This remarkable woman traveled extensively in West Africa. She wrote 2 splendid books, The Travels in West Africa and The West African Studies. She possesses a phenomenal talent for studying the African. With subtle mental grasp, she penetrated beneath the thin covering of deceitful appearance and empty forms, and touching the heart of Negro life, she felt the power and charm of his better and nobler self. She caught a glimpse of the Negro as he is, and returning from her vision alone, she effectively pleaded his cause before a world ignorant of his ways. While on her last trip to Africa and in her last letter to the press, she wrote, "The white race seems to me to blame in saying that all the reason for its interference in Africa is the improvement of the native African. And then to start on altering institutions without at least understanding them, and the African to blame for not placing clearly before the Anglo Saxon that what African institutions really are, and so combating the false exaggerated view given of them by stray travelers, missionaries, and officials who, for their own aggrandizement, exaggerate the difficulties and dangers with which they have to deal. It is mere human nature for them to do this thing, but the effect produced on the minds of our statesmen has terrible consequences." So she was saying that the people that were writing about Africa were lying about it for their own financial benefit and their own glory and aggrandizement, to say that they overcame these natives that were cooking people in pots, or that were cannibalizing people, or that were sacrificing people in ritualistic death ceremonies, or whatever lies they came up with as the missionaries, that they were lying. She said that they were lying. Again and again, she urges that there should be some organized method of studying the native laws and customs and publishing accounts of them, so that you know European culture, and you who know European culture and who also know African culture will take your place as true ambassadors and peacemakers between the two races, and place before the English statesman the true African. Destroy the fancy African made by exaggeration that he has now in mind. Following the death of Miss Kingsley, and under the name of the African Society, a noble band of men and women have undertaken the consummation of this work, which has been so ably began. As Dr. Blyden says, their concern is not with the physical or material, but with the psychological aspect of the question. They have organized themselves to be set free the soul of their protege from influences incompatible with his race individuality and race life, to show the world Africans helping in the work, that the African has a culture of his own, to explain that culture and assist him to develop it. Associated with this movement, either actively or in their writings, are some of the most eminent persons before the English public. I can only mention a few: Lord Cromer, Sir George T. Goldie, the Count de Cardi, the Right Honorable John Morley, Sir Alfred Lyhall, the Right Honorable H. Asquith, Dr. J. Scott Kelty, Sir Matthew Nathan, H. Dagville, Mr. George Macmillan, Sir Alfred Jones, Sir H. Johnston, and the Right Honorable Lord Avebury. Besides these persons and others prominent in England, are some able West African Negro authors such as the well-known Dr. Blyden, Mr. Casey Casely Hayford, and Mr. John Sarba, the author of Fancy Customary Laws. Before Miss Kingsley published her West African studies, Sir A.B. Ellis, M. Lee Comte Descartes, Mr. John Harford, Mr. John Sarbar, and a few others had already made valuable contributions to the study of the Negro in Africa. Greetings, Blanca J. And since her death, other important instructive volumes have been added to the list. One by Dr. Nassau, who has spent over half a century on the West Coast, living among the Bantu tribes, who was considered by Miss Kingsley as perhaps the most ablest authority on the West Coast of Africa, and one of Mr. E. D. Morel, who under the title of Affairs of West Africa gives to the public a rich fund of information about the Negro. A second edition of Mr. Sarbar's book has appeared, of which Mr. Morel wrote, Fancy Customary Laws has been universally regarded since the appearance of its first edition in 1897 as the only real standard work on the Aboriginal jurisprudence of the Gold Coast people, and as one of the most valuable ethnological contributions existent of that people. Excuse me. So, as you can see, there were people writing the truth, they just weren't publishing the truth, because if it bleeds, it leads. You know, if it bleeds, it sells. And these people wanted to sell the sensational idea of Negroes in West Africa so that they could sell books and tell lies. This is a high tribute from a high authority to a native Negro in West Africa. Another very valuable volume has appeared, one by Mr. T.J. Aldridge on Sherbro and its hinterland. The writer of this book has passed 30 years in Africa and traveled over 6,000 miles among its people. Still another volume has appeared under the title Advance of Our West African Empire by Captain C. B. Wallace, now British consul at Monrovia. Captain Wallace has had a rich and varied experience among the tribes on the West Coast, and his work is a valuable contribution to West African literature. So, if there ever was any justification for the statement that the Negro is unmoral, it has now passed away in the light of a broader knowledge of the facts. The quotations from the authorities now existent on the Negro and his life showing that he not only has moral conceptions, but moral standards would make a volume. I will venture to give one more from Sir A.B. Ellis, whose works concerning the tribes of West Africa are regarded as models. In discussing one phase of morality among the Yoruba people, he says, at present, the feeling of annoyance which a Yoruba bridegroom experiences when he finds that his bride has been unchaste is not due to jealousy or sentiment, but to a sense of injury, because his rights acquired by betrothal have been trespassed upon. But no doubt, in course of time, the sentimental grievance would be produced. Whether this feeling ever extends to the lowest classes is uncertain, but at all events, it has scarcely done so in Europe. In quoting the above passage, I must say that I fully recognize that many things that are said by Sir Ellis in this chapter, Marriage Laws and Customs, at first glance may be thought to support the statement of Mr. Noble. But when they are thoroughly understood and carefully considered, they are found to prove that the Yoruba speaking people are unquestionably possessed of moral conceptions and standards. And the whole chapter, so far as these people are concerned, contains a most splendid refutation of the absurd idea that the Negro is unmoral. Sir Ellis says that marriage is prohibited by the Yorubas between all relations closer than second cousins. For the first reported neglect of delinquent husbands, a palaver is held by the wife's family. And for subsequent offenses, the wife may leave, and in some cases, her family may flog the offending husband. Adultery is punishable by divorce or death, but may be settled by damages. It is hardly necessary to cite other facts from this author showing the morals of the Negro in light of the following statement from a high authority on ethical subjects. If then incest is prohibited and community of wives replaced by ordinary polygamy, and moral improvement will have been effected and a standard of virtue formed, but this standard soon becomes the starting point of new progress. Sir James Mackintosh, speaking on the universal character of the moral foundations, remarks, "The facts which lead to the formation of moral rules are as accessible and must be as obvious to the simplest barbarian as to the most enlightened philosopher. The Negro might rest his case with the weight of reason as well as of scholarship in favor of the universal existence of the innate moral faculty of the human race. But tried by the ultimate ethical sanctions now generally recognized by both the utilitarian and intuitive schools, the Negro has all the essentials and morals, and we're unmodified by the baneful effects of outside evil influences. The great mass in Africa, according to their own standard, established by their own institutions, live a moral life. They have their physical, political, social, natural, and religious sanctions operating among them under the severity of African conditions and supplying all the motives for their moral lives. The Negro tribe that has no moral conceptions is yet to be discovered and described. Of the dozen or more in Liberia, none are so low but have what they have, gree bushes, or institutions for special instruction and protection of their girls, laws regulating marriage and defining crime, and numerous customs, the purpose of which is to secure respect for the aged, obedience to parents, reverence for the fetish gods, and to save the captured in war from the pangs of death. As far as disclosed by competent students, similar conditions exist among all pagan tribes. You may judge the morals of the millions of the finer Negroes of the Sudan, of whom, in speaking of Timbuktu, Lady Lugyard wrote, "Here, the learned of Spain and Morocco and Arabia are proud to come and share the wisdom of the natives of the Sudan, and long biographical lists have been preserved of the distinguished professors, black and white, who taught in the schools of this and other towns or enriched different departments of science, art, and literature with their labors. So clearly, they had a moral guide, they had a moral code, and that moral code was one that was actually met with the standard of what would have been considered morals by European thought leaders. However, the propaganda that escaped and the ideology that got out there was that Negroes have no morals or Negroes are unmoral. To continue to dehumanize us and to profit from us, because that at the point that they recognized that we had morals and we had a basic humanity about ourselves, they could no longer justify treating us as beasts of burden. I'm going to read 4 by Proverbs and the explanations that follow them. They're all contained. And then we'll read some more on Thursday. No matter how poor an elephant is, he cannot cross the bridge. When someone comes to the king to beg of him when times are a little hard with him, he often says that he is poor himself, but he gives the man something, adding, no matter how poor an elephant is, he cannot cross the bridge, meaning that no matter how poor the king may be, he cannot allow the man to go without having given him something. The monkey wants to get honey, but he has no axe to cut the tree. When a poor king is ambitious to build up his town and often remarks that what he would do if he only had the money, he is reminded by somebody that the monkey wants to get honey, but he has no axe to cut the tree. Black skillet is no good for making soup, or making soup in a black skillet is trouble. When they see a man doing something that is thought will lead to trouble, they ask the man, are you making soup in a black skillet? It is the general opinion that soup cannot be made in a black skillet without trouble, in that it all gets black, or else the person is so poor that he cannot afford to buy a pot. And lastly, a baboon does not like cola for anything. A baboon was very hungry, and although he was accustomed to eat cola, he slept under a cola tree all night. Yet he complained of being hungry with cola nuts all around him. Sometimes a person asks for something which he thinks he has lost, but which is close at hand. Perhaps it's in his pocket. When he finds it, he says to himself, a baboon does not like cola for anything. All right, guys. What did you guys think about those institutions and some of his rantings about the fact that they were just lying in the other books that were written? I think that he was a bit disenchanted with the establishment because he had read all of these encyclopedias and biographies and geographies and missionary reports and all of these sensational books that talked about what it was like in Africa. And when he got there, he found out they were regular, everyday people. They just had their institutions. The forecast says, interesting. Of course, they lie on us, though, because it's profitable. Exactly. Exactly. They lie on us because it is profitable for them to lie on us. They lie on us because they can make money selling a book to others and playing on the imagination of others while we suffer the cost. We suffer the burden of them having told those lies because they looking at us like, are you one of those cannibals? If we believe the lie, they can stay in control. Exactly. If we believe the lie, they can stay in control. They can stay in control. And they've been repeating their lies long enough and loud enough, so much so that sometimes we believe the lie, unfortunately, because we didn't know any better, especially at this time. Now, in this day and age, we should know better than to believe some of the lies that have been told. But at that time, when they were writing all of these missionary reports and all of these different things, you know, like social media is the new missionary report because they show off all of these interesting, funny, sensational things that are not true, you know, and we have to discern what's true and what's not true, what's real and what's not real, what's AI generated and what's not. And we have to pass that information on to our children and to our loved ones so that they won't get sucked into the nonsense like they're eating the cats and they're eating the dogs, you know? So, as you can see, they probably were if they were telling the lies that we were eating people and that we were cannibals, you know, I do think that on occasion, because of our interaction with white people, that they may have beat their children too hard because that sometimes happens to this very day. A story was in the newspaper last week where a grandmother beat her granddaughter to death and then laid her in the bed because she knew the little girl was in bad shape and she didn't want to go in there and deal with it. So she let the little girl die. The little girl was like 2 or 3 years old. And this was a black woman on the East Coast of the United States of America that beat her grandchild to death, you know? So I think that a similar thing could have occasionally happened in that culture. But I don't think it was a regular occurrence because they invested too much into their children to consistently have this behavior of beating them into submission, you know, of beating them to death with the gree bush and the devil's bush. They invested too much into them with the Boro and the Sand institutions. They invested too much into raising their children to be productive members of the society to replace the adults to take care of the aged. They invested too much into them to just go about killing them, you know, without any regard with, you know, wild abandon. I don't think that happened. So I thank each and every one of you for coming by. I want to thank KW Don 7, The Forecast, and Blanca J for being here with me. I know that Ra and the elders are listening. I know that Bawana Haguziki is listening. I know that Koku is listening. I know that Oni is listening. I know that Brother Bakari is listening and so many others. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. Thank you so much for being here. I will be back on Thursday. We'll read some more of their proverbs, and if we get to it, we'll read some of their folklore. So thank you guys for being here. Peace.